From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's program, where Professor Emile Schrijver will talk about the Jewish book since the invention of printing. It's our first program in our series celebrating 100 years of Hebraica at the Library of Congress, 1912 to 2012. And we have an exhibit right across the hall called Words Like Sapphires that I hope you will go see after this program. I must tell you that I'm wearing a corsage today, in case you didn't notice, and it was given to me by my significant other who wanted me to wear it last night, and I said, I don't think I could do that. I said, but I'll be sure to wear it today, and it will be webcast in the program, so you'll be able to see me wearing it. So our next program will be on Monday, where we will have a public celebration and a display of items, rare materials, in celebration of the publication of Perspectives on the Hebraic Book, the Myron M. Weinstein Memorial Lectures at the Library of Congress. That book was published in June, and so we'll have a panel discussion on Monday. It will be downstairs in LJ 119, and I invite you all to attend. For the rest of our programs, please go to our website, either the African Middle Eastern Division website or the Hebraic section website. I first met Professor Emile Schrijver and really got to know him in May of 2010 when I attended a 2-day workshop, the Manfred R. Lehman Memorial Master Workshop in the History of the Jewish Book, held at the University of Pennsylvania. He spoke and gave a series of lectures for 2 days on the Jewish book in and around Amsterdam, which was just wonderful. Professor Schrijver is the curator of the Bibliotheca Rosenthaliana, the Jewish Special Collection at the University of Amsterdam. He's also a curator of the private Braginski collection of Hebrew manuscripts and printed books in Zurich, Switzerland. And he's the interim curator of the Eitz Chaim Livraria Montesinos in Amsterdam. He's an expert of post-medieval Hebrew manuscripts and printed books, and has published and lectured extensively on both topics. He's written a number of introductions to facsimile editions of Hebrew manuscripts and has published numerous auction and exhibition catalogs. He serves on boards and advisory committees of numerous Jewish cultural organizations in and outside the Netherlands. Next year, he will be the professor of the Hebrew book, the first such professorship, we think, at the University of Amsterdam, in addition to all of his other responsibilities. I need to let you know that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period after the lecture. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, Professor Emile Schrijver.
Thank you very much. I remember that for one other lecture I once was standing like this all the time, not realizing that you can do this with a microphone. So this seems a little bit better. I'll be speaking, as they call it in free speech. I will be showing you a large number of images. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's quite an humbling occasion, I must say, that to be this tiny little expert in this huge building, of learning. So I thank you very much for that occasion. I will be speaking about the Jewish book since the invention of printing on the occasion of the opening of the exhibition here in the Library of Congress. And I must say that unknowingly, the talk and the exhibition provide us with a balanced view of the entire period. There are certain items of certain products of the Jewish book since the invention of printing that are not very well represented in the exhibition and that I happen to concentrate on here in this talk. And the other thing is much more true. There's a lot in the exhibition that I won't be speaking about, and that lot is also since the invention of printing. So I think that you will get a broader insight into the phenomenon of Hebrew books, the production of Hebrew books since the invention of printing. Our traditional division of Hebrew books, the one that I learned many years ago when I started this profession, was that between the medieval and the post-medieval book. And I think that division is artificial. It's incorrect. The invention of printing is an invention of the late Middle Ages. So the only division of Hebrew books that one can work with really is the division before the invention of printing and after the invention of printing. So this is much more practical and a much better division than that between medieval and post-medieval books. What I will do is I will take you through this history of the Jewish book since the invention of printing, printed books, but also a lot of handwritten books, manuscripts, and I will do so on the basis of images. The large majority of the images that I'm using are images taken from one of the collections, from the collections that I'm responsible for. But I will try to make connections with items in the exhibit whenever it's pertinent. So without further ado, as a famous jazz saxophonist usually says, this is one of the first books ever printed in the 15th century. The first Hebrew books printed in the 15th century were 6 books that were printed between 1469 and 1473 in the city of Rome. They were done by a group of printers, Obadiah, Manasseh, and Benjamin, and these 3 printers produced 6 books, and this goes to show the character of the field that we're working in. There are 2 specialists of Hebrew books printed in the 15th century in the world. One is my predecessor in the Rosentaliana, Adrie Offenberg. The other one is Shimon Jakobson from St. Petersburg. And they disagree on the order of printing of the first 6 books that were ever printed. In fact, Adrie Offenberg thinks that he nailed it and that he knows the order in which they were printed. And he believes that this is the 6th book ever printed in Hebrew. Shimon Jakobson says that he isn't sure of the correct order of the books. And of course, as a scholar, one tends to believe someone who's not sure, but maybe who am I to disagree with my predecessors? So I don't know it. There's one book actually from the same printing press also in the exhibit, Serashba, I think, Ibn Adret, and a beautiful book, and go look at it. And what strikes me most actually of these early Hebrew printing is the quality of the product. It's unbelievable. The first 6 books that were ever done, and they look as if they were printed yesterday. The technique, the way in which the people already mastered the technique in this very early period of printing is unbelievable. There were a total of 140 books printed, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less in the 15th century. The large majority of them in Italy, a considerable group in Spain and Portugal, and only one in Constantinople in 1493. I think it was finished on the 13th of December. That takes us to the 16th century, where really Venice dominated the nature of the history of the Hebrew book. So Venice was the #1 center of the production of Hebrew books in the 16th century. Hundreds and hundreds of Hebrew books were printed there, and the most important printer was actually a non-Jewish printer, a Christian from Antwerp, by the name of Daniel van Bombergen, or Daniel Bomberg, as he's usually referred to in Hebrew. One of his Talmud editions is also in the exhibition. Here we have a commentary on the Pentateuch and the 5 scrolls that he printed. And basically what what Daniel Bomberg did is that he provided us with all the standard editions of rabbinic literature. The editions, as we read it, of the Palestinian Talmud, of the Babylonian Talmud, are actually presented to us in the manner in which they were devised by Daniel Bomberg and the Jewish and non-Jewish specialists with which he produced his books. So Daniel Bomberg is very important, especially for the, I would say, even for the canonization of rabbinic literature. And that is particularly relevant for this text of the Talmud Yerushalmi that he did. We know that he used one particular manuscript only. He claims in his introduction that he used a number of manuscripts for his edition of the Talmud Yerushalmi. But it was actually already proven more than a century ago by Sheila Tsenezi in his catalogue of the manuscript in Cambridge, in an appendix to that, that he probably used only one manuscript. And this one manuscript is kept nowadays in Leiden, also in the Netherlands, in Leiden University Library. It's the famous Talmud Yerushalmi from Leiden University. It's the only known complete manuscript of the Talmud Yerushalmi. We have to be aware of that for both the Talmudim, as a result, most probably of non-Jewish aggression, we only have one complete manuscript, a complete manuscript of the Yerushalmi in Leiden, and one complete manuscript of the Talmud Bavli in Munich. Interestingly, if you look at the text of these manuscripts, and if you look at the colophons of the scribe of the Leiden manuscript, and we know for a fact that Bomberg used that particular manuscript, he claims in his colophon, it's very interesting, that he worked from what he called a defective copy, and that he tried to correct the defective copy as much as he could and to the best of his knowledge. That's the text that we're reading nowadays. So the manuscript that we have is a manuscript that was considered inappropriate or incorrect, inappropriate is not the right word, but incorrect by the person who copied it. But it's the only thing we have. And as soon as it got printed in 200 or 300 copies, it became the text that we still study nowadays. And this is the story of the transmission of Hebrew text. Generally, these Hebrew manuscripts these printers were, let's put it differently, these printers were aware of the fact that they had a responsibility and to try to find as many manuscripts as they could and the best quality manuscripts that they could. But they had to make do with what they had. And this is what we have here, a defective manuscript. And the same is true of the Munich Talmud Bavli. When you look at the Mishnaic text, which I once did many years ago, when you look at the text of the Mishnah in the Babylonian Talmud, in the manuscript in Munich, and you compare it to the so-called good manuscripts of the text, it's full of differences. So what we have nowadays, what happens once you start to print a text is that it standardizes, that it becomes canonized in a completely different manner. Once suddenly you have 300 copies and it's reprinted, you have another 300 or 500 copies. But the manuscripts that these texts were based on were problematic, to say the least. We have to be aware of that. 16th century is also important. Basel is also important. A very important aspect of 16th century Hebrew book production is the involvement of Christians. There was a lot of printing for a Jewish audience, but there was also a lot of printing for Christian humanists. And Basel was the most important center for that. There was Hebrew printing also in Paris, Christopher Plantin in Antwerp, later on in Leiden in the late 16th century. It was all for a Christian market in Geneva. Everything for Christian market. Basel was the main center there, and here you have an example of a dictionary, of a Talmudic dictionary, Aruch, Aramaic dictionary. The Aruch, as it was printed in Basel in 1527. The humanists, the Christian humanists, set great store to knowing the Hebrew language because they were interested in the ideal of eruditio trilinguis, the trilingual erudition. So they wanted to be able to study the text of the Bible in its three basic languages, be that Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, of the Vulgate translation. So there was a major production, and I must say that the quality of these Basel imprints is fantastic. I mean, they're among the most beautiful books that were produced. I was once told not to use this sort of epithet in a lecture, and don't tell your audience that something is beautiful, but I happen to love these books from Basel, so what can I do about it? This is 16th century Prague, 1526, probably the most important book published, or at least the best known book published in Prague, the famous Haggadah, 1526. Part of the imagery is actually completely non-Jewish. When we look at the border here, this is imagery that was probably borrowed from non-Jewish printers who were working in Prague at the time. The tiny little image in the middle within the text border actually shows this is the Haggadah, so this shows the coming, so this shows the prophet Elijah, who's the person heralding the coming of the Messiah. So this is that particular moment in the Seder scene, in the Seder ceremony, where you open the door for the prophet Elijah, who's going to come and herald the coming of the Messiah. And this is what you see here. This is, I think it's the prophet Elijah, or it's the Messiah himself, and they're opening the door for him. And so there is a combination of Jewish and non-Jewish imagery in a book like this. And that is really the story of the 16th, and in a way also the story of the 17th century. Another story of the 16th century with a very well represented, very nice example also in the exhibition is the phenomenon of censorship. The Christian Inquisition, the Italian Inquisition, became interested in Hebrew books as they became interested in heretic books in general. And they started to concentrate on these Hebrew books and actually demanded that owners of Jewish books, owners of Hebrew books, would come to the censors to have their books censored. They would have to pay for that nice little service. They would sign their books. These censors would sign the books with their name. Here at the bottom of the page, one reads the Domenico Ierosolimitano, the Domenico of Jerusalem. They did this in 1598, and frankly, there is hardly a book that has been in Jewish hands, a Hebrew book that has been in Jewish hands in Italy, that does not have a censorship signature. So it's a very well-known phenomenon, and there are a couple of censors, Domenico Ierosolimitano, Camillo Jagel, a couple of other censors, of whom I must have seen hundreds of signatures. They must have been sitting there all the time and just signing manuscripts because they knew exactly where to look. They were usually converts, so the Jews who became Christians because they knew the text, and they were probably the Jews' worst enemies after that. But what's interesting, and what is interesting also in the copy that is shown here in the exhibition, is that they tended to use brown ink rather than black ink, and that you can easily read what is underneath. So it was really an act of aggression towards the Jews, but it seems a couple of centuries later that it seems as if they were not as interested in whether the people were really able to read it or not. Of course, this external censorship led to a form of internal censorship as well. Many Jews who would print text or who would hand copy text would actually decide to leave out certain passages in which the censors believed there was anti-Christian content, rather than print it and have it censored afterwards. So there was there is also the phenomenon of internal censorship, which is the direct result of this Christian aggression. I think one can use that word, but political aggression towards Jewish books. In the Brzezinski collection in Zurich, which I'm also curating, and there was an exhibition of the Brzezinski collection in New York 2 years ago, there's a group of 11 documents that was sold at Kestenbaum's a couple of years ago, which actually originally belonged, Italian letters, which originally belonged in the file of a Phoenician censor. And these are Italian letters that actually describe the acts of aggression, describes the burning of Jewish books, for example, in 1553, first in Rome, and a couple of months later, September of 1553, and that is why we have it here. And we don't know exactly where they come from. The provenance is kosher enough for it to be sold in public and for it to have been bought in public. But these are censorship letters describing the actual event, which is very moving and also very impressive. So that's the censorship. And that takes us to the 17th century. And the 17th century is what I talked about in Philadelphia. It's really the 17th century is really the age of Amsterdam. The Jews had come to Amsterdam, the first Portuguese Jews had come to Amsterdam by the end of the 16th century, 1596, 1597. We know of the first Portuguese Jews who came to Amsterdam. We have to realize that it's more than a century between the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1495-96 and the first settlement of the Jews in Amsterdam in 1596, 1597. They were in France, they were in other places, and the traditional story that one hears is that the Jews were sent there and went there for the freedom of religion, which is probably partly true, but they also went there because Amsterdam became an important economic center, and Amsterdam became more and more important in the trade with the New World. So Amsterdam was important for the trade triangle between Porto in Portugal, Amsterdam, and the New World. So the sugar trade especially was important, and that was another reason why the Jews decided to settle there. So the Portuguese Jews settled in Amsterdam. They built, only 70 years later, they built a fantastic Portuguese synagogue in which a Chaim library is housed. And the first Jew to print a book in Amsterdam was Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh ben Israel is a very important figure, worthy of 5 more lectures. But I only point them out here. This is the only portrait that we have of him that it was actually done during his lifetime. There is another etching by Rembrandt, which is believed to be, by some, to be Manasseh ben Israel. But again, Adrie Offenberg has proven, I think, definitively that cannot be Manasseh ben Israel. Manasseh's first book was printed, appeared. It's a prayer book, Sephardic prayer book, appeared on 1st of January 1627. And there have been experiments with Hebrew printing in Amsterdam before that. So there was a guy by the name of Hugh Broughton, an Englishman, and he already, but a non-Jew, and he already experimented with Hebrew printing in Amsterdam. But the first Jew to print Hebrew in Amsterdam was Manasseh ben Israel. There are only 3 copies of this first edition of Manasseh ben Israel known. We in the Rosentaliana have practically all his publications, but not the first one. The 2 in Oxford, and one is in the Valmadonna collection, which is somewhere in the basement at Sotheby's in New York at the moment, waiting to be sold. And Jack Lancer, the owner of the Valmadonna collection, actually promised to me, and there's a connection with the Library of Congress, once promised to me that I would be the one who would get that book, I being the Bibliotheca Rosentaliana, of course, but he never lived up to the promise. I want to have that book. This is actually the introduction to his first book, and this is the introduction of the Corrector. And the Corrector was this interesting figure, Isaac Aboab da Fonseca, who was actually the rabbi of the community for a period of almost 60 years. So he's been there. He's been in Brazil for a while when the Jews settled in Pernambuco, but he went back and he writes a very interesting introduction. He says, Manasseh ben Joseph ben Israel, seeing the Bomberg types worn out, so here we see Bomberg from Venice again, and since nothing can be imperfect for the holy work, arose from within the community and went out, and came to the house of an artisan. And behold, he was standing there at his work, the tools of his trade in his hand. And he said to him, behold, the money is given to you in the shapes of the letters to make as is good in the eyes of the honorable and respected Michael Judah, first among the scribes. May the Lord consummate his work, etc. The man swore in real writing to make them for him and for no other man. He shaped them with the burin and made them good to look at and fine to read, as perfect as if cast in gold. And there were 2 men who were amazed to see the completeness of the work and its beauty, and it lifted up their hearts, and to bring to the work of printing a little siddur. And this is an important text. This is the text by the Corrector. What it shows is a realization on the part of the printers that they need a good Hebrew type. And that the only standard for the Hebrew type could be handwritten type. So what they did, they had type designed, Hebrew type designed by a non-Jewish type designer, based on the Bomberg types, based on other types already used, but to be vetted, so to speak, by the local scribe. And that's very important. And that has to do also with a deliberate, I would say, identity strategy or identity politics on the part of the Sephardic elite in Amsterdam. So they wanted to be identified with the Sephardic tradition. Those who knew the Sephardic tradition were the scribes. They wrote the holy text in the Sephardic letters, and they used the Sephardic letters in Amsterdam. And these are Manasseh's types, the largest Hebrew Manasseh's books, compared with Lebey's text. That's the one underneath, and you can see that the difference isn't all that big. And it's interesting because they based themselves on the letters that were already around, but they had them approved by the local scribe, and these letters became known as the famous, as the famous letters of Amsterdam. these letters of Amsterdam became so famous, and the books printed in Amsterdam became so famous that printers outside Amsterdam would actually start to print their books, as they say, beotiot Amsterdam, with the letters of Amsterdam. And they would print the word Amsterdam on the center of their title page in large lettering, suggesting that the book was actually printed in Amsterdam. But it said beotiot Amsterdam, with the letters of Amsterdam. And it would say in small type, it would state that the book was printed in Frankfurt am Main, or that the book was printed in Offenbach. So Amsterdam was really a trademark for good printing, and that probably had to do with the quality of the paper, with the quality of the images, with the quality, the sharpness of the type, the sharpness of the printing, and generally with the splendor of this Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community, and later on the Ashkenazi community that was able to produce books of that particular quality. And that's so much for Amsterdam. I'll return to that. I just put in one book that actually Michael Grunberger published on. Ben Avigdor is an interesting figure. A group of books printed after this 18th century. Our traditional histories of the Hebrew book usually end somewhere around 1800, 1820, as if nothing was ever printed afterwards. We are getting there now today. I mean, there's numerous colleagues, one of them is in the room, who actually indicate and actually stress the fact that Hebrew printing continued. And I think that one of the great qualities of the exhibition here is that it shows the continuity of the Hebrew book production. The Hebrew book production didn't stop in the 18th century. This is one example. This is a guy who was actually instrumental in professionalizing the publishing history of Hebrew books. So he was one of the first who was actually a real publisher rather than a printer who sought to distribute his book. So he was very important in the professionalization of Hebrew books, but it's just a completely random example, and it happens to be a nice image. So if you go to opposite and you see the exhibition, be aware that the books that you're seeing there are part of a continuous tradition. I think that's the one of the great merits of the exhibition here, and it goes into the 21st century, and it's beautiful to be aware of that, and to be aware that we do not stop somewhere around 1820, as most of our predecessors have done. But there was more than just Hebrew printed books. There were also Hebrew manuscripts. Hebrew manuscripts were produced since Gutenberg, since the invention of printing in general. And I'm working on a grouping of these manuscripts. It's in a way it's my grouping of these manuscripts. I mean, there are many ways to do it. This works for me at the moment. It might not work for others, but it's going to happen. So we have Sifrei Torah, Megillot Esther. We have to be aware of that Sifrei Torah, the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, as it is used, and there's a nice 17th century Torah scroll in the exhibition. The Torah scroll is an object that is produced until today, actually, and it's a handwritten book. And one thing that we have to realize is that the one big difference between the Jewish book world and the non-Jewish book world is and especially the Christian book world, is the iconic nature of the book. We consider Judaism, we consider the Jews the people of the book. It's an important aspect in the exhibition. But the appropriation of the term "people of the book" is actually a 19th century phenomenon. Where the 19th century Jews, because the first mention of the people of the book, of the people of the Bible, is in the Quran. I mean, it's taken from the Quran, and the Jews have appropriated the term as late as the 19th century. And we have to realize that in Christianity, when one looks at books, one looks at Bibles, medieval Bibles, and one sees the centrality of the book as an object of veneration in the religion, with beautiful stones on it, and gold and everything, and just beautiful books from ever since the medieval period. In Judaism, there are a lot of beautifully produced books, but the iconic object of veneration within the Jewish religion is the Torah scroll, and not the book. And that's a big difference. I mean, for me, it's one of the explanations why many Hebrew books actually tend to have, let's say, not too nice bindings. I mean, when we look at our books, and when we look at the books that we're dealing with in the Hebrew world, many of these books were actually used. I mean, when we look at medieval non-Jewish manuscript, the medieval Christian manuscript, many of them looked as if they were never looked at. that may well be true in many cases. I mean, they were looked at, but they were never used to the extent that Jewish books were used. There are hardly any Hebrew books that do not show severe signs of use. And I know of 18th century Haggadah, handwritten Haggadah, that don't have a single spot on them. They don't have wine stains on them, they don't have all the food remnants in there. And the only reason for that, this is interesting, should I cancel or say okay? Okay. The reason is that they were never in Jewish hands. So these books that don't have the stains were never in Jewish hands and were never used. So it really has to do with the fact that the Torah scroll is the object of religious veneration. And if Jews take the trouble of putting nice bindings around their books, or have taken the trouble of putting nice bindings around the books, that's usually in response to the surroundings in which there was a fashion to do so as well. Jewish tradition, and in that sense, the people of the book is really the people of the content of the book. A Jewish book tradition is really about the content, it's really about learning and about the transmission of knowledge through that particular object rather than something else. The same is partly true of the Megillot Esther, the text of the Megillah, of the Esther scroll that is read on Purim. Then we have prayer books, we have single sheet manuscripts. A lot of manuscripts were just a single sheet. In Amsterdam, there are beautiful examples of Chazanut contests where the texts that were to be sung by the cantors were copied by hand on a beautiful parchment sheet, and we can't hear the voices anymore, but we still have the beautiful parchment sheets. Of course, Ketubah, marriage contracts, are a couple of nice Oriental examples in the exhibition. Autograph, learned text, that's another group, Oriental manuscript, Hasidic and Kabbalistic manuscripts, and a group that I will concentrate on afterwards. I have a couple of examples for everyone, but I will be concentrating most on group number 7. This is a Megillah from I'm not going to show Sifrei Torah because there's not a lot to see there other than beautiful Hebrew text, and you can see it downstairs. This is a Megillah that was done in Amsterdam in the, let's say around 1700, maybe a little bit earlier, in Amsterdam. It's in the Brginski collection in Zurich. And this is typical of a group of manuscripts, of a group of Megillot, of a group of Esther scrolls with the story of the liberation of the Jewish people in Persia, as it is read on Purim. And here we see the banquet at the beginning of the Esther of the Esther story. It's a group of Megillot that was done in Amsterdam, and we know of 6 or 7 of them, and they have very, very detailed illustration. And interesting about this illustration is that the illustration does not only follow the text of the Megillah itself, of the biblical text, but it also includes all the midrashic material, all the narrative material that was collected within Judaism after the completion of the biblical text. So the maker of this particular Megillah was very much aware of the entire narrative tradition that surrounded the text of the book of Esther, and included the illustrations included the illustrations that deal with that midrashic content. This is another example of a Megillah. This one was printed with a printed border, and a handwritten text was produced in Italy. This is another one in Italy with beautiful cutout, sort of paper cut, but it's parchment, with beautiful cutout decoration, which was also done in Italy in the 18th century, probably in Ancona. This is a beautiful Megillah in the Gross collection. This is the first time that I'm not showing items from the Rosentaliana or the Brginski collection. This is the Gross family collection. William Gross, the collector of Tel Aviv, is the collector of this. And this is a beautiful little Megillah. I mean, it's this high. It's unbelievable. And it was reproduced actually in facsimile by Facsimile Editions in London, a company that does deluxe facsimile editions of Hebrew manuscripts. And it follows closely, very closely, the text of the Megillah, and it's sort of circular. So you have to read it in a circular way, so you can read the illustrations together with the text. It's very, very delicate. At the same time, it looks very naive. But that's the quality of Hebrew manuscripts after the invention of printing, a combination of naivety on the one hand, because Jews didn't have access to proper art training, to proper drawing training, painting, but they were aware of the nature of the text. And what's interesting here is that all the figures are sort of fantasy-like orientalizing figures, with the exception of the figure on the right in the middle panel, standing behind the lectern, Mordechai. Mordechai, the hero of the Esther story, is actually depicted as a Jew, as a rabbi of the 18th century with a Shabbos decal, so that's the flat beret-like head covering that he wears, because one had to identify with the hero. One had to identify with Mordechai. So he was depicted as the 18th century Jew and as with the, let's say, the ultimate example of human virtue. So that's why he looked like we look, to put it that way, and that makes it easier for people to identify with it. So one tends to disregard or discard these folkish sort of Megillot as, well, this is folk art, it's substandard. But when you look at them very carefully, it actually tells you a lot about your interpretation and about your appreciation of the text of the Megillah. This is a huge PowerPoint, so it takes a while for the images to load, I hope. Yeah, there it is. This is another example. Here again, we have a Megillah from the Brzezinski collection, and here again, in the center of the image, above the Hebrew text, there's again an image of Mordechai depicted as an 18th century rabbi. A similar example. He's actually also wearing a fur coat. This is a beautiful Megillah from the Brzezinski collection, one that was sold at Sotheby's a couple of years ago. It was done in the 19th century, and this is much more playful, a fantastic example. This Megillah was actually based on images taken from a puppet theater. There was a puppet theater in Lyon, in France, in the early 19th century, Guignol, and these puppets look exactly like these. And the puppets were actually used to illustrate the story of the Megillah. You see it in much more detail. They're very funny. I mean, they're quite violent also, but most of the imagery in Megillot is violent because a lot of violence happens to happen there. But this is beautiful stuff, and also the cheeks, the orange cheeks are typical of the puppets, the hand puppets that were used in this Guignol theater in Lyon in the early 19th century. There's a lot of humor in there. And these were illustrated. Texts like these were most probably not used for the reading of the Megillah in synagogue, because we have long discussions all the time. We can do that in the question and answer section on whether one is allowed to make illustrations or not. And what one has to say is that this type of illustration would distract the reader while reading the text of the Megillah in synagogue. So these were rather produced for private use during the Purim festival, reading it in a family setting rather than in a synagogue setting, because you would not have used, a Megillah like this would not have been used in a community setting because it would distract the reader and it was not serious enough. Then we have prayer books. This is just an example. I'm going to show a lot more prayer books. This is a prayer book copied by Zuriel Probst in Dessau, 1674. We see that a lot of Hebrew prayer books were still copied by hand. This is all manuscripts that I'm showing. They were copied by hand, and that had to do also with an appreciation of handwritten Hebrew. And this appreciation came from the fact that the holy texts are handwritten. So there was always a higher appreciation of handwritten texts. This is a beautiful Ten Commandment sheets from the Bibliotheca Rosentaliana in Amsterdam. A beautiful example of floral decoration to which I will return later. This is a nice Ketubah from Italy, done in the time of Garibaldi, which goes to show the rebel leader in Venice in the middle of the 19th century, which goes to show, which explains why all these Italian symbolism is on this Ketubah. Another Ketubah from Venice. This is a Ketubah from another Italian place, Massa di Carrara, all in the Brzezinski collection. This one is from Rome. If you want to be smart or want to look smart, and you see a Ketubah, which is actually where the neck is pointing downwards, it's always Rome. So, and they did it in Rome because they rolled up a Ketubah in a particular manner. So what they would start at the top, they would roll it up, they would have a little cord at the end of the neck of the animal, and they would present it to the woman. Because the woman, actually the woman still is the one who gets the Ketubah. Her rights are stipulated in the Ketubah, and the particular way of presenting it to the bride after the wedding ceremony dictated the nature of this. So you walk into a Ketubah exhibition, it goes downward, and you say, hey, that's Rome. So that's the way to do it. This is another example from Rome. It's very easy. This is Amsterdam. I'm going to show that same image again. This was done in 17th century Amsterdam. This is the second stage of a Ketubah that was actually used within the Amsterdam, is being used within the Amsterdam community, the Sephardic community, until today. This is an autographed manuscript, a learned text, a book of Evronot. There's another example of Ibronot, as you have it, or Evronot, in the exhibition downstairs. This is an example from the Brzezinski collection. This is an autograph of a famous rabbi by the name of Yuspa Worms, Likutei Yosef. This is an Oriental manuscript by Shlomo Adeni. This is actually a book that he had notes. This is a commentary in the Mishnah. And this particular figure, Adeni, who lived in the Holy Land, was so poor that he had to make all his notes in the margins of a printed book until someone gave him a reams of paper to copy all his notes into this particular book. And this is the manuscript. So this is the autographed manuscript in which he copied all his notes from his printed edition of the Mishnah, and it's the only autographed manuscript that we have. It's now in the Brzezinski collection. This is a Hasidic manuscript, a prayer book with Hasidic prayer, with Kabbalistic prayers, and this is a manuscript, and this is what we're concentrating on from now on. Manuscript with Amsterdam letters. This is Siddur, copied by Aryeh ben Yehuda Leibtrevich. It's kept in the JTS library. There's another one in the Jewish Museum in New York. And there are a couple of others. There's one in the British Library by the same artist. And this artist started off a school of manuscript production, which would actually copy by hand the Hebrew books that were printed in Amsterdam. And they would state on their title page that they copied these books Otiot Amsterdam, just as the printers had done. So they actually went to the trouble of writing by hand Hebrew books with the letters of Amsterdam. Interestingly, the first manuscripts that were produced were huge Sidorim, daily prayer books that were presented to the communities, and they're beautiful. I mean, they're the most beautiful examples. So that, and in the course of the decades following 1712, this is the very first example that we have. In the course of the decades following, the books became smaller. They didn't become bigger. So it started off as a phenomenon of the court Jews in Vienna, the Wertheimers, the Oppenheim family, all the court Jews that were instrumental in financing the wars of the wars that were going on in Europe, the wars that were going on in the German land. They had very prominent positions at the courts. They were called court Jews, and these court Jews commissioned Hebrew books, handwritten Hebrew books, which were then presented to the community, and after that, especially Haggadot and smaller prayer books, which became your typical upper and middle class present for a wedding, for a bar mitzvah, for whatever. This same artist did a beautiful Moelbuch, a circumcision booklet, in 1716. It's kept in the Brzezinski collection, where here we see the actual circumcision scene in synagogue. And he did a very interesting scene on the left-hand page of the biblical, but not canonical, of Tobit, the figure of Tobit. And Tobit and Tobias. So this is the biblical Tobias who went to, but not in the Hebrew Bible, but only in the Catholic Bible. He went to go look for the gall of a fish which he needed to cure the blindness of his father. It's a very interesting story. He's on his way together with the Archangel Raphael, and this happened. This is in the Jewish prayer book. Why would someone take the trouble of including a non-Jewish image like this one in the Christian prayer book? And one of the explanations that I gave in the catalog is that the Raphael is actually considered the protected, how do you call it, the guardian angel of the children within Catholicism, which is one explanation. The other explanation is the name Raphael. Rapha means curing, and there's a medical aspect to circumcision, as we all know. So that might also be the reason why this is included here. But the truth is, the final truth is that we don't know it. And this is the only example that we have. So that's something that makes this school very interesting. They were creative artists. This is another guy by the name of Meshulam Zimmel of Polna, who actually calls himself, also in this title page, he says, Charut ala luchot. So he claims that he engraved his images onto the plates, which is not true. I mean, he drew them, but he considers himself an engraver, and the quality of his imagery is really engraving quality. So he was probably copper engraver. This is a strange text called Perek Shirah, and I just continue. This is our same friend working in Vienna. Here we have a manuscript with Amsterdam letters, a Haggadah, which is actually a copy of a printed Haggadah. And here he says, Katafti in the middle, Haggadah in Perusha Bravanel, Botiot kanit pas ba Amsterdam, in the center of the image, with the letters as printed in Amsterdam. This is the most important scribe of that particular school, Aaron Schreiber Herlingen. He did a Megillah. This is kept in Bryn Mawr College. This Megillah is this big. He was a miniature artist like no other. This shows you what it is. And there's in the British Library, there's actually a tiny little Megillah, as big as a matchbox, the full text of the Megillah with images, which he also did. And he did a lot of other things. He did this image of King David, which is actually built up of Latin letters. A Jewish scribe working in Vienna in the middle of the 18th century. Aaron Wolf, 1751. So this is what it looks like. And he says, Aaron Wolf, Kaiserlich Königliche Bibliothekschreiber in Wien. He considered himself Royal and Imperial Library scribe in Vienna in 1751. And this, the piece that I had on the first slide, a new acquisition in the Brzezinski collection, actually a French text, Louis XV. Louis XV, Louis XV in France, in French text. And you can look at the detail here. He calls himself Aaron Wolf, écrivain de la Bibliothèque Impériale, Vienne, 1752. So he worked for an audience that was Christian and that was not Christian, that was Jewish and was not Jewish. Aaron Wolf, écrivain de la Bibliothèque. And to see the amount of detail, this thing is this big. I mean, it's nothing. Another scribe, Wolfleib Katz-Poppers, that nobody ever heard of. This is a manuscript in Hebrew Union College. This is a wonderful combination of black and white penwork and colored illustrations in a circumcision booklet. But this is a Megillah that he did. A Megillah that will be published next year by Taschen Verlag. The entire Megillah here is written in German. So this is a Megillah written in German, going from left to right and not from right to left, 60 meters long. And it will be published in facsimile. It's huge. I mean, it's this high. And we never heard of the guy, but he signs it. He signs the manuscript in Cincinnati, he signs this thing, and there is a total of 5 Megillot that he did, 1 in German, and there's a total of 5 prayer books that he did. So there were all sorts of complicating factors after the period of this is my closing, there are all sorts of complicating factors. Different scripts, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, combination of different scripts. There's different languages, Spanish, Judeo-Spanish, Arabic, Judeo-Arabic, Persian, Italian, Judeo-Italian, and many more Jewish languages. It's a combination of different languages. Like this polyglot, like this multilingual edition, handwritten copy actually for a printed book, the famous Complutensian polyglot of the 16th century. This Latin book this Hebrew book with the Latin interlinear translation of the Psalms. It's going on. There are more complicating factors, different media, printed and handwritten. This image. What they didn't tell you when they showed this image first is that the border around the word slichot is actually printed. It's printed within the handwritten book. So the scribe went to a printer, but Hebrew was not printed in that time, went to a printer to print the border into the handwritten book, which is crazy, to put it mildly. But it happened, and we have other examples. There's the geographical variation. There's the chronology and the availability of sources. I'm going to show you 2 manuscripts, one from the Brzezinski collection, the Charlotte von Rothschild Haggadah, done by Charlotte von Rothschild for her uncle Amschel Rothschild. In 1842, when I used to tell my story of Hebrew manuscript after the invention of printing, I was top in 1820. And suddenly 2 manuscripts pop up. This beautiful illustrated Haggadah, which is now also in the Brzezinski collection, done by Charlotte Rothschild for her uncle. And this beautiful Victor Bouton Haggadah, a beautiful Haggadah done in the 1870s in Paris, probably also for the Rothschilds. And this has a wonderful combination, non-Jewish artist, a Jewish text, the Haggadah, and Islamic decoration. This is Islamic decoration as it appears in Quran manuscripts from Persia, especially from Shiraz in the middle of the 17th century, but also in Istanbul. So, and also in Turkey, but also in India. It's basically all over the place. But this type of illustration was available there. And this happened only 5 years ago, so frankly, we have no clue. But generally, because I have a nice slide that says in sum, and so this is another image of Bouton. It gives you a sense of the detail here. This is just going through here an additional example of the complexity of Jewish books since the invention of printing. That was before I knew that was going to run out of time. It's very slow. Whatever. I can do it. I can also do this from without the examples. The history of the Jewish book after the invention of printing is a history of Jewish art. Lots of the Jewish art that we have of the medieval period is almost exclusively books. Jewish art that we have from the period after the invention of printing is not necessarily only books. So that's where a genuine Jewish art developed and could be studied. But it's more than anything else a history of the transmission of knowledge. And that's what it's a history of the appreciation of beautiful images. It's a history of a term that's also being used in the exhibition, Hiddur Mitzvah, the beautification of the commandment, the concept that it is a religious obligation to make the performance of the biblical commandments as beautiful as you can. That goes to explain the quality, the artistic quality of the Hebrew books. But more than anything else, regardless of the quality of the art, it's a history of the transmission of knowledge through printed books. But if we look at the numbers in the period after the invention of printing, also through handwritten books. We have numerous editions of, frankly, we have so much more Hebrew manuscripts of the post-medieval period than manuscripts of the medieval period, that it is a disgrace that we, students of the Hebrew book, speak of medieval manuscripts and disregard the rest as senseless. I mean, there are tens of thousands, literally, of Hebrew manuscripts since the invention of printing. Many of them have never been studied, and I think that the realization that printing was not possible without the presence of Hebrew manuscripts, and that Hebrew manuscript, the production of Hebrew manuscript, existed alongside the production of Hebrew printed books, that typifies the period that I spoke about. And the only thing I can say is, if you didn't do so, go see the exhibit and enjoy yourselves, and thank you very much.
Okay, that was a feast for our eyes, and of course you can go across the hall and look at the exhibition. But before you do so, if you have any questions for Professor Schrijver.
And first of all, I want to tell you how much I enjoyed your presentation and how much I learned. My question is, why is it after after printing, when many of the manuscripts were printed, why is it that people went back to or wrote manuscripts? I mean, what was the justification for writing manuscripts after the printing?
Well, part of the explanation, I think, is as prosaic as it gets. It's a matter of money also. So printing a book costs money. Printing a book was not possible everywhere. There were not Hebrew printing presses available everywhere. So in many cases, the best example is Yemen. In the Yemen, the large majority of books were copied by hand, and they actually went so far that students who would learn to write would copy not just the Aleph Beit, or would copy not just text that they could learn, but would actually copy a Haggadah and would copy a Siddur and would copy books that people could use. Because paper was scarce, there was no printing press around, Hebrew printed books were only being brought by traveling agents and the traveling dealers, so there was an awareness, so there was a necessity to copy books by hand. The other explanation is really it was both in Europe and in the Orient. The other thing is that there is a particular, I mean, also in the non-Jewish world, we have autographed manuscripts of books. So that's but the other explanation is really the appreciation of handwritten Hebrew texts, which is connected directly, I think, with the holiness of the Hebrew script as the script that's being used to produce the Holy Bible, so to produce the Hebrew Bible. So it's the holiness of the Hebrew handwriting, which is also part of an explanation. For example, one of the questions that I once asked a great specialist of medieval manuscripts, Malachi Betarier, the greatest specialist of medieval manuscript, is why don't we have purple manuscripts like we have in the Latin world? In the Latin world, you have manuscript where the parchment is purple and where the lettering is in silver. Why don't we have it? And his answer was very interesting. One would think that that's something that is not being done because it's not part of the synagogue tradition. But he says probably the main reason is that the scribes were aware that they were not allowed to do so on the basis of the laws of writing a Sefer Torah. So the laws of writing a Sefer Torah stipulate that the ink has to be applied directly to the parchment. And it's when you dye the parchment, there is dye in between. So the people were very much aware, especially the people producing that, were very much aware of the holy nature of the Hebrew script, and there was also a particular appreciation of the handwriting of learned people. So, especially in Orthodox circles, within Hasidism, it even developed into a cult almost of the handwriting. The handwriting of the great rabbis was considered as holy as the rabbis themselves. And there's still people flying around the world trying to find examples of the handwriting of the Chacham Tzvi, of Yaakov Emden, of all the other great rabbis. So there was also a particular appreciation of the handwritten thoughts of the great rabbis, so it's a combination of these factors. There's no one answer to it.
Chris,
Yes. First, I want to say thank you.
you'll have to repeat the question.
Think about material for guidance on responsibility there. But I have a question specifically about Amsterdam. And I'm thinking about London in the 1680s, when a large number of French Huguenots who had been expelled come to England, and the whole just a sea change of the aesthetic of everything that's made in England. Did the same sort of Huguenots went to Amsterdam? Did the sort of thing happen in Amsterdam, and did it affect the book production?
It's a very interesting question, whether something similar to London, where the Huguenots, where as soon as the Huguenots came, they took a great influence on the production of everything cultural, basically, and everything graphic. Whether that was true of Amsterdam as well, where the Huguenots also came. And I think part of that is true. The Jews were very much aware also of similarities in their position, but between their position and the position of the Huguenots in Amsterdam, and because they were both groups that were allowed to stay in Amsterdam for many different reasons. I mean, I wouldn't say that it played such a big role in the aesthetics as a whole. I would be more careful to do so, also because I don't really know examples that would prove that point. But of explosion of the arts in Amsterdam in the 17th century, all the great paintings were done there. So, but yes, there was a similarity between the position of the Jews and Huguenots, but they were also, in a polemical sense, they were also enemies. Which is a big word, and not in the violent sense, but we have all sorts of polemical manuscripts. The Jews who returned to Judaism in 17th century Amsterdam wrote, I mean, what they saw the obligation, the rabbis saw the obligation to convince the Jews who had gone to Christianity, the Portuguese Jews who had gone to Christianity, to convince them of the superiority of the Jewish religion over the religions of the world, over the other religions, that being Christianity. And there's all sorts of polemical manuscripts of polemics between Huguenots and Amsterdam Jews. The question is always, that's the story that one always tells, and they try to draw in the Catholic Jews or the Jews who had become Catholic under the pressure of the Inquisition, and with these tractates they try to prove the superiority of the Jewish religion. When you look at these books, I mean, they're big, they're incomprehensible, they're available in 10 handwritten copies, they were never printed. I'm not convinced. I mean, who read that? This is a thing of the intellectual elite. The intellectual elite was in constant conversation with the Christian world, but not the masses. So, the part of the answer is really that we don't know. But I know what you're talking about in London, and it's not comparable to what was going on there in Amsterdam, but there are similarities.
All right, at this point, we're going to end. Thank you very much, Professor Schreiber. That was wonderful. And I hope you will come to our other programs that will be coming up beginning Monday. And please go see the exhibit now.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.